The moment Abigail Dugan told Thomas Malone she was not the kind of woman men stayed for, he reached down, unbuckled the leather strap of his saddlebag, and set it on the floor of her porch with a quiet, deliberate thud that said more than any words he could have offered. The year was 1878, and the town of Harrow Creek, Texas, sat at the edge of everything too far west to be considered civilized by the people of Dallas, too far east to be considered frontier by the men who drove cattle up through the Panhandle. It was a town that existed in the in-between, and Abigail Dugan had long decided that in-between was exactly where she belonged. Not quite claimed, not quite free. Just surviving, which was its own kind of living. She had come to Harrow Creek 6 years prior in the autumn of 1872 on the back of a supply wagon driven by a man named Gerald Dugan, whom she had married in Abilene when she was 22 years old and desperate enough to call a stranger's kindness by the name of love. Gerald had been 41 and decent in the ways that a man could be decent without ever truly being warm. He had given her a roof, a name, and a small parcel of land on the eastern edge of town, and then he had given her nothing else at all because the cholera had taken him in the spring of 1874, leaving her a widow at 24 with a house that needed constant repair, a vegetable garden that refused to cooperate, and a reputation as a woman who had already outlasted one man. The people of Harrow Creek were not cruel, but they had long memories and short imaginations. They watched Abigail with the particular mix of pity and wariness that small towns reserve for women who survive without softening. She ran a small laundry business from the wide back porch of her house, taking in clothes from the miners and the ranch hands and the occasional family of means who thought it beneath them to wash their own things. She worked hard and she kept quiet, and she did not ask for anything she was not willing to earn herself. By 1878, she was 28 years old, and she had made a kind of peace with the life she had built. It was not a joyful life exactly, but it was hers. The garden had finally started cooperating. She had repaired the sagging porch herself with lumber she had traded for. She had 2 cats, one gray, one orange, that slept in the sunny patch near the south window. She had a rifle she knew how to use and a reputation for never needing to use it twice. And she had the absolute, bone-deep certainty that whatever love was supposed to feel like, it was not something the universe had built into her particular design. That was the woman Thomas Malone rode into Harrow Creek to find, though he had not known he was looking for her. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the heat was just beginning to think about breaking, but had not yet committed to it. He came from the direction of the Cimarron Range, which put him north and slightly west, and he rode a brown and white paint horse with an easy gait that suggested the animal had been well and carefully kept. Thomas himself was 31 years old, tall in the saddle, with brown hair that had been lightened at the temples by a season spent largely outdoors, and dark eyes that had a particular quality of attention to them, the kind that made people feel noticed when they did not necessarily want to be. He had spent the last 7 years working cattle, 2 seasons up in Wyoming, 3 in Colorado, and the last 2 on a cattle drive operation out of San Antonio that had finally dissolved when the outfit's owner, a man named Corliss Webb, had died without clear instructions about what was to happen to his affairs. The other cowboys had dispersed in the way of men without permanent stakes, some north, some east, some deeper into the frontier territories. Thomas had ridden south and then east and then found himself, for reasons he could not entirely account for, turning toward Harrow Creek because a man named Dutch, who had ridden with him through the Colorado seasons, had once mentioned that Harrow Creek was a decent town for a man who was thinking about stopping. Thomas had been thinking about stopping. He was not tired of riding, exactly. He was tired of arriving places and leaving them again before they had the chance to become anything. He was tired of the way men who lived out of saddlebags talked about permanence, as though it were a thing that happened to other people. He had watched Dutch talk about stopping for 3 years before Dutch actually stopped, settling on a small ranch outside of Laramie with a woman named Margaret who made pie on Sundays and kept chickens. Thomas had ridden away from that scene with a feeling in his chest that he could not name but recognized. He rode into Harrow Creek and took his horse to the livery stable, where an older man named Ezra Potts took one look at the paint and said the horse would be comfortable enough and the rate was fair. Thomas paid for 3 days and then went to the saloon, not to drink heavily, but because saloons in small towns were where information lived, and he needed to know whether Harrow Creek had any work that a man with his particular skills might reasonably do. The saloon was called the Red Spoke, and it was owned and operated by a woman named Clarice Alderman, who was 45, and had the bearing of a woman who had seen every kind of human behavior and found most of it moderately disappointing. She poured Thomas a glass of whiskey and told him, unprompted, that Harrow Creek had a general store, a blacksmith, a feed store, a small church that served 4 denominations on a rotating schedule, and a doctor who was competent on most days. "What it does not have," Clarice said, refilling his glass though he had not asked, "is a decent ranch hand who is not already promised to one of the bigger outfits. John Harlan out on the Harlan spread has been looking for someone who knows horses and is not afraid of long days." Thomas said that described him well enough. Clarice studied him with the frankness of a woman who had learned to read men the way other people read weather. "You planning to stay, or are you planning to stay until something else takes your attention?" "I am planning to stay," Thomas said, and he meant it in the way that felt new and fragile but real. He went to see John Harlan the following morning. Harlan was a direct man of 52 with a spread of about 200 acres, a herd of mixed cattle and horses, and 3 permanent ranch hands who were solid but overwhelmed. He interviewed Thomas in the yard in front of the barn, asking practical questions about cattle management, horse care, fence repair, and what Thomas knew about the local water rights disputes that were beginning to simmer between the larger operations to the west. Thomas answered honestly and completely. Harlan shook his hand and told him he could start Monday, with a bunk in the ranch hand quarters and a wage that was fair for the region. Thomas thanked him, and then, because he had 2 days before Monday, he went back to town to find a meal that was not trail food. It was on his way through the eastern edge of town, past the small row of houses that backed up against the open scrubland, that he first saw Abigail Dugan. She was on her porch, and she was angry. Not at him, she had not yet noticed him, but at a man who was standing in her yard with his hat in his hands, and his expression doing the complicated thing that faces do when people are pretending to be reasonable while actually being unreasonable. The man was perhaps 40, broad through the shoulders, and he was dressed in the particular way of someone who owned something and wanted you to know it. "The arrangement was fair when Gerald was alive," the man was saying, "and there is no reason it should not continue to be fair now. The arrangement Gerald made was for Gerald's laundry at Gerald's price," Abigail said. She was holding a basket against her hip with a posture that suggested she had been in the middle of something and deeply resented the interruption. "You are asking me to do double the laundry for the same price, and I am telling you no. You are a widow woman running a laundry on a bit of property that exists at the goodwill of this town. I own this property, Mr. Fitch," Abigail said, and her voice was very clear and very quiet in a way that was more dangerous than shouting. "Gerald left it to me in proper legal title, and I have the papers to prove it. So we can discuss the price for your laundry, or we cannot discuss it at all, but we will not be discussing my goodwill." Fitch settled his hat back on his head with the slow deliberateness of a man pretending he had decided to leave rather than being sent. He walked past Thomas on his way out of the yard without acknowledging him, and Abigail watched him go with her jaw set and her eyes steady. Then she noticed Thomas. She looked at him the way she had looked at Fitch, without warmth, without particular hostility, just with the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had learned that unannounced men in her yard were more often trouble than not. "Can I help you?" she said. "I do not think so," Thomas said honestly. "I was passing through. I was not meaning to intrude." She studied him a moment longer. "You are new," she said. It was not a question. "Arrived yesterday, Thomas Malone. I will be working out at the Harlan spread come Monday." Something in her expression shifted slightly, not warmth, but a marginal reduction of the specific wariness she kept for completely unknown quantities. Harlan was a known name in Harrow Creek. Working for him was a minor credential. "Abigail Dugan," she said, and went back inside her house. Thomas stood in the road for a moment, looking at the space where she had been, and then walked back toward the center of town with the particular feeling of a man who has just seen something he was not prepared for. He ate supper at the small boarding house that also served meals, run by a woman named Hester Clark, and he listened to the dinner table conversation with the quiet attention he had brought to most things in his life. There were 4 other people at the table: a traveling salesman from St. Louis, an older couple named Whitmore who were passing through to see their daughter in El Paso, and a young man named Pete who worked at the general store and had the enthusiastic chattiness of someone who had not spoken to anyone new in several weeks. Pete mentioned Abigail Dugan without Thomas asking. "Best laundry in 3 counties," Pete said, with genuine admiration. "Gerald Dugan was a decent man, but he never worked half as hard as she does. She has got clients from the Harlan spread and from the Miller operation, and even from the mercantile families over in Crockett who send things by wagon." "She seems capable," Thomas said, which was the most neutral thing he could think of. "She is more than capable," Hester said, without looking up from her plate. "She is the most self-sufficient woman in this part of Texas, which is either a virtue or a tragedy depending on how you look at it." Thomas looked at it from both angles on his walk back to the boarding house room he had rented for the week, and found that from either direction it made him feel the same inexplicable thing in his chest that he still could not name but was beginning to recognize. On Wednesday, he went to the general store for supplies he would need for his bunk at the Harlan spread, and on the way back he took the longer route that happened to pass Abigail's property. He told himself this was because the road was less muddy on that side, which was not entirely untrue. She was in the yard again, this time hauling water from the pump to the large copper tubs on her porch where she did the washing. The work was heavy, he could see the strain in her shoulders and arms, and she was doing it with the focused efficiency of someone who had long since made peace with the fact that it was simply what had to be done. He stopped at her fence. "Good morning," he said. She looked up and recognized him with a slight adjustment of her expression that was not quite a smile, but was at least an acknowledgement that he was a known quantity and not a threat. "Mr. Malone, can I carry some of that water for you?" he asked. She looked at him with the careful evaluation of a woman who had learned that offers of help almost always came with attached costs. "Why?" she said. It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. "Because you are hauling heavy water and I am not hauling anything," he said. She regarded him for a moment longer, then stepped back slightly in the way that was an invitation without being anything so vulnerable as a welcome. Thomas came through the gate and picked up 2 of the waiting buckets and carried them to the copper tubs. He made 3 more trips while she managed her own loads, and when it was done, she had enough water for the day's washing. "Thank you," she said, and it came out with the slight roughness of someone who did not say the words often enough to make them easy. "You are welcome," he said. And then, because she was clearly about to return to work and he did not want to impose, he tipped his hat and left. He did the same thing on Thursday, and again on Friday. On Saturday she offered him coffee, which he accepted and drank on the edge of her porch while she kept her hands occupied with sorting and folding and the quiet industry that seemed to be her natural state. They talked carefully, the way people talk when they are not sure yet what the other person is made of. He told her about the cattle drive work, about Wyoming in winter, about the specific satisfaction of knowing horses well enough to understand what they needed before they could tell you. She told him about the garden reluctantly, but in the way people talk about things they are genuinely proud of, and about the laundry business, and about the way she had learned to read weather from the pressure in her knees, which had been broken and healed badly during a wagon accident the year before Gerald died. "That must have been painful," Thomas said. "It was," she agreed, with the flatness of a woman who had long since finished being upset about it. "But it works. It just has opinions about rain." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came without warning, and she looked at him with a brief expression of surprise, as though she had not expected the sound and found that she did not entirely mind it. He went to the Harlan spread on Monday as agreed, and the work was exactly what he had been told it would be. Long days, hard ground, horses that needed consistent and knowledgeable attention, cattle that needed moving and fencing and periodic persuading. The other 3 ranch hands were men named Cal, Edgar, and a younger man everyone called Birch, who was 19 and riding his second cattle season, and still had the freshness of someone who thought the work was mostly adventure. Thomas liked them well enough, the way you like people when you are going to spend most of your waking hours with them, and the relationship needs to be functional. John Harlan was a fair employer in the way of men who had themselves worked hard and remembered what it felt like. He did not ask for more than he was paying for, and he paid what he promised, which put him ahead of several outfits Thomas had worked for. Thomas settled into the rhythms of the ranch through October with the ease of someone who had spent his entire adult life learning how to settle into new places quickly. He was good at the work, genuinely good, not just competent, and Harlan noticed, the way employers notice the people who are actually carrying weight without being asked to do so demonstrably. But every Saturday and most Sundays when the work allowed it, Thomas went back to Harrow Creek, and every time he found himself at Abigail's fence. The visits stretched from water hauling into actual conversation, which stretched from guarded exchanges into something that felt, tentatively and with several false starts, like the early architecture of friendship. Abigail was funny in a dry, understated way that surprised him every time, because she delivered observations with such a neutral expression that it took a beat to register that she had just said something genuinely sharp and clever. She was also honest to the point that it sometimes felt like a small, controlled shock, because she said what she meant without the elaborate softening that most people considered politeness. He liked this about her enormously. He also noticed, in the way of someone paying close attention, that she was careful never to ask him questions that might invite personal depth. She would answer his questions about her life, her history, the town, the work with a plainness that felt like transparency but actually had the shape of a careful perimeter. She shared facts but not feelings. She described events without confessing how they had made her feel. And whenever the conversation moved in a direction that felt warm, she had a way of finding something in the yard that needed her immediate attention. One Sunday in November, when the air had finally turned cold enough to see your breath, and the sky was the particular deep blue that Texas gets in late autumn, he brought her a small bag of coffee beans from the general store, because she had mentioned 2 visits ago that she was running low and had been stretching what she had. It was a small thing. He had not put much thought into it beyond the practical. She held the bag and looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, and then she said, "You do not have to keep doing this." "Doing what?" he asked. "Coming by," she said. "Helping, bringing things." She set the coffee down on the porch railing and turned to look at him directly. "I know what you are building toward, Mr. Malone, and I want to be straightforward with you before it goes any further." He waited. He had learned that she needed him to wait. "I am not the kind of woman men stay for," she said. It came out plainly, without self-pity and without drama, the way she might have stated the price of her laundry service or the distance to the nearest town. Gerald did not stay, not by choice, but the truth is he was already gone before the cholera. He had been leaving in small ways for years before his body finally followed. And the man before Gerald, the one I thought I was going to marry back in Abilene, left in less poetic fashion. He simply chose someone easier. She looked at Thomas with eyes that were very clear. "I have made my peace with this. I'm not miserable. I'm not asking for your pity. But I think it would be unkind to let you continue in a direction that does not have a good destination, and so I am telling you now." The wind moved through the scrub brush at the edge of the yard. The orange cat appeared from around the corner of the house and sat down beside Abigail's feet, with the self-important authority of a small animal that considers all spaces its own. Thomas reached down, picked up his saddlebag from where he had set it on the porch steps when he arrived, and then set it down again with a deliberate, quiet thud. Abigail stared at it. "What are you doing?" she said. "I heard what you said," Thomas told her, "and I am not going to argue with your history because it belongs to you and you know it better than I do. But I want you to know that I have been thinking about stopping for a long time, and I stopped here. Not because of you at first. I did not know you yet. But I know you now better than I have known most people, and I am not leaving. So I am setting my bag down." She looked at him for a long moment, and there was something in her expression that he had not seen before, not the softening of someone who has decided to be romantic, but the complicated expression of someone who wants something and is terrified of wanting it, who has built careful walls not out of cruelty but out of necessity, and who has just been presented with evidence that the walls might not be as necessary as she had believed. "You will regret this," she said quietly. "Maybe," he said. "But I would like to find out." She picked up the bag of coffee beans from the porch railing, looked at them for a moment, and then went inside to make the coffee. He sat on the porch steps and watched the sky go orange and purple over the scrubland, and felt something ease in his chest that had been tight for a long time. It did not suddenly become easy after that. Abigail was not a woman who had built her careful architecture over years and then dismantled it in an afternoon over coffee. What she did was allow Thomas to keep coming by, and she allowed the coffee on the porch to become a regular thing, and she allowed the conversations to gradually become longer and reach into slightly deeper territory. This was, for Abigail, an enormous amount of allowing. Thomas understood this and did not push. He had worked enough with horses to know that the most important thing you could do with an animal that had reason to be wary was to be consistent. Not dramatic, not insistent, just consistently present, consistently the same, consistently trustworthy in small ways until the larger trust became possible. November moved into December, and December in Harrow Creek was cold but not brutal. The winds came down from the panhandle, and the nights dropped hard, but the days still had enough sun to make the frost bearable. Thomas worked long hours at the Harlan spread through the cold months, helping move cattle to the lower pastures, repairing fence that the early frosts had stressed, managing the horses through the transition to winter feeding. He was good at the work, and he came to genuinely like Harlan and the other hands, and the ranch began to feel like a real place in the way that places feel real when you are invested in them. On Christmas Day, which Harlan gave his hands off, Thomas rode into town and found Abigail in the middle of a project she had clearly been planning for some time. She was attempting to repair a section of her roof where the winter cold had found a gap, and let in a draft that she said had been waking her up at 3 in the morning with cold air across her face. "You cannot go up there in this cold," Thomas said, looking at the ladder propped against the side of the house. "I have been going up there in this cold for the last 2 hours, Abigail said. "The problem is I cannot figure out where the gap is from the inside, and from the outside the shingles all look the same." Thomas looked at the roof, and then at her, and then said, "Tell me where the cold comes in." She described the area of the ceiling above her bed, and he went up the ladder and found the problem in about 10 minutes, a section of shingles that had lifted slightly at the corner and let air in through the gap beneath. He had the materials to fix it partially with what was in her small storage shed pitch and a few spare shingles she had saved from a previous repair, and he spent most of the morning on the roof while she worked below, calling up occasional comments about whether he had found the right spot. When it was done, he came down the ladder and she had made lunch. Real lunch, Not just coffee, cornbread, and beans, and the sort of simple, hearty meal that made sense in winter, and tasted better than it had any right to on a cold, clear Christmas morning. They ate at her kitchen table, which was the first time he had been inside her house, and he looked around with the quiet attention of someone who wanted to understand a person better and was reading the space as a kind of text. The kitchen was clean and organized with the precision of someone who was responsible for everything themselves and had learned that disorder made hard work harder. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam. He recognized sage and rosemary, and something he thought might be lavender but could not be sure. There was a bookshelf against the far wall with 8 books on it, which was more books than most households in Harrow Creek contained, and the spines were worn in the way of books that had been read more than once. There was a quilt on the chair by the window that had been made from different fabrics, none of them matching, with the cheerful impracticality of something stitched for comfort rather than appearance. "Who made the quilt?" he asked. Abigail glanced at it. "I did, in the first winter after Gerald died. I had more time than I knew what to do with." She paused. "It is not particularly well made." "It looks like it was made by someone who needed something to do with their hands," he said. She looked at him with the expression she got when he said something that reached slightly past her perimeter, and then she looked at her cornbread. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what it was." They were quiet for a while eating, and the quiet was comfortable in the way that quiet becomes comfortable between people who have shared enough time to not need to fill it. "Malone," she said finally, which was what she called him when she was thinking about something and had decided to say it. She had stopped saying Mr. Malone sometime in late November without either of them remarking on it. "What are you actually looking for?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I do not entirely know," he said, "but I think I am looking for something that does not leave when the season changes." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub, and the gray cat appeared on the windowsill and regarded them both with the indifference of a creature that had already evaluated the situation and found it acceptable. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear it plainly." "I am listening," he said. "I do not know how to be easy," she said. "I have tried and I cannot do it. I am not soft and I am not gentle in the ways that most men seem to need women to be, and I have made peace with that. But I have been watching you for 3 months and I have not been able to find the thing you want from me that is going to make you go away, and it is starting to make me wonder if maybe there is not a thing." Thomas set down his fork. "There is not a thing," he said. "I am not saying I believe you," she said quickly, with the self-protective speed of someone who has been hopeful before and has the scars to prove it. "I am saying I am noticing." "That is enough," he said, and it was for now. January brought a harder cold snap than Harrow Creek usually saw, with ice on the ground for a solid week, and the horses at the Harlan spread needing constant attention to keep their water from freezing and their hooves from getting brittle. Thomas worked through it with the focused endurance of a man who knew cold and did not love it, but respected it. And Harlan added a small bonus to his January wage, as acknowledgement that the extra work had been done without complaint. During the cold week, Thomas checked on Abigail every day he could manage. He brought extra firewood on Tuesday. She was burning through it faster than she had stocked for, and had been rationing in a way that was keeping her warm but not comfortable. He did not make it into a significant event. He simply arrived with the wood and stacked it against the side of the house, and then stayed for coffee, which they drank near her stove because the porch was not viable in that weather. On the 3rd day, when he arrived, she opened the door before he could knock, which meant she had been watching for him. "I was not going to mention it," she said when he looked at her, "but you might as well know that I was watching for you." He smiled slowly. "Good," he said. She made a small sound that might have been a scoff or might have been something else and let him in. They talked that afternoon for 3 hours, longer than they had talked before in a single sitting, and the conversation reached into territory they had both been skirting. She told him about Abilene. Not just the man who had chosen someone easier, but the family she had come from. A father who had been a minister, and a mother who had been quietly practical in the way of women who understood that the world was not going to rearrange itself for their benefit. She had 4 brothers, all of them dispersed now, 2 in Kansas, 1 in Missouri, 1 she had not heard from in 4 years and thought might be in New Mexico territory but could not be sure. Did they not want to keep track of each other? Thomas asked. We are not that kind of family, she said. We were all taught to be self-sufficient from very early on. My father believed that dependency was a form of weakness. She paused. I used to think he was right. Now I am less certain. This was, he realized, the closest she had come to saying that she wanted something she did not yet have. My family was different, he offered. My mother kept everyone in correspondence. Letters every month, whether there was news or not. She would write 3 pages about the weather just to maintain the connection. He smiled at the memory. She died in 1873, fever, and after that the letters stopped and we all scattered in the way of people who have lost the thing that held them together. I am sorry, Abigail said, and she said it with the directness of someone who meant it and had no use for elaborate condolences. Thank you, he said. I think about her. I think she would have liked Texas. What would she have liked about it? The sky, he said. She was always looking at the sky. She had a theory that the sky told you things if you knew how to read it. Abigail looked out her window at the pale winter sky over the scrubland. What kind of things? She was not entirely specific, Thomas admitted, but she was very certain about it. Abigail laughed. It was the first real laugh he had heard from her, not the controlled, dry amusement she sometimes allowed, but an actual laugh surprised out of her, the kind that changes a person's face completely and shows you something they did not mean to show. She caught it almost immediately and pressed her lips together. But it had already happened, and they both knew it had happened. Thomas looked at her with the careful attention he had been bringing to everything she did, filing it away like something precious. You should laugh more, he said quietly. It takes the right material, she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady in a way it had not been before. February arrived with the particular cruelty of months that should be warming but refused to, and with it came a complication that Thomas had not anticipated. A man named Hector Foss rode into Harrow Creek from the direction of the Brazos River country and set up business at the Red Spoke for 3 days, and Clarice told Thomas on the 2nd day that Hector Foss had known Abigail from Abilene. Thomas did not know what to do with this information. He was not, he told himself firmly, the kind of man who monitored who knew which woman. That was not the shape of thing he was building with Abigail. But Clarice said it in a tone that suggested the information was worth considering, and Clarice was a woman who dealt in useful facts. He went to see Abigail that afternoon and found her already agitated. He could tell by the set of her shoulders and the particular efficient sharpness of her movements in the yard, the way she moved when she was working through something difficult. I heard Hector Foss is in town, he said. She looked at him. Clarice has a gift for circulation, she said. Is he the one from Abilene? Thomas asked. He is, she said, and something moved across her face that was not quite pain and not quite anger but had elements of both. He is the one who chose someone easier. He married her in 1871. I do not know what he is doing in Harrow Creek and I do not particularly want to find out. Does he know you are here? He will by this evening, she said flatly. Small towns do not keep secrets for longer than a Tuesday. Thomas sat down on her porch steps, not to take up space or make declarations, but because he had learned that being steadily present was sometimes the most useful thing he could offer her. Do you want me to stay? He asked. She looked at him for a long moment. The gray cat came and sat beside him on the steps, as though providing its own opinion. Yes, she said, with the difficulty of a woman who has made a commitment to honesty and sometimes finds that honesty requires more bravery than she has immediately available. Hector Foss came to the house the following morning while Thomas was there, which was either coincidence or deliberate, and Thomas was not sure which interpretation made Foss less appealing. He was a well-dressed man of about 40, with the look of someone who had done reasonably well for himself and wanted it to be noticed. He had a manner that was smooth in the way of people who have practiced being charming without ever becoming genuinely warm. He was not expecting Thomas. He stood in the yard and looked at Thomas on the porch with a recalibration of expression that happened quickly and did not quite resolve into anything natural. Then he looked at Abigail. "Abigail," he said, with the specific warmth of someone deploying warmth deliberately. "You look well." "Mr. Foss," she said, "I heard you had settled here." Married, and then he let the sentence trail with a sympathy that had the texture of something rehearsed. "Widowed, yes," she said. He looked at Thomas again. "I did not mean to intrude." "Then you can go," Abigail said. Not rudely, she was rarely rude, but with the clear finality of a woman who had decided how much of her time a given person was worth. Foss lingered for a moment longer in the way of people who have rehearsed a conversation that is not going the way they prepared for, and then he nodded once and left. When he was gone, Abigail let out a breath that she had clearly been holding. "All right?" Thomas asked. "Yes," she said. "I thought it would feel like something." "It mostly just feels like a Tuesday." He felt something warm and expansive in his chest at that. "Good," he said. She looked at him and then looked away in the direction of her garden, which was bare and waiting for spring. "Malone," she said quietly. "Yes. I think I owe you an apology." He frowned. "For what?" "For being so certain you were going to leave," she said. "It was not kind. You had not done anything to deserve that certainty, and I gave it to you anyway because I was afraid, and I let the fear make decisions for me." She paused. "I am not particularly good at admitting that kind of thing." "I know," he said gently. "I noticed," she said, which was as close to thank you as she could manage in that moment. Spring came to Harrow Creek the way it always did. Gradually and then all at once, the scrub land going from brown to the particular green that only Texas gets in April, fragile and vivid at the same time. Abigail's garden came back with a vengeance. She had improved the soil with composted material through the winter, and the results were visible in the density of what was growing. She had tomatoes and peppers and beans, and a section she was experimenting with for sweet corn, which she said Gerald had always thought was not worth the trouble, but she had always thought Gerald was wrong about that. Thomas came to help her stake the tomatoes in April, and they worked side by side in the garden for most of a Sunday afternoon, in the easy companionship of two people who have stopped performing normalcy around each other and have arrived at the actual thing. "Tell me something you have never told anyone else," she said, without preamble, while she was tying a tomato stake. He thought about it seriously. "When I was 20 years old," he said, "I spent a winter in a lined shack on the Wyoming range alone for 3 months. No other people for most of it. And in the second month I started talking to the horses." He paused. "Not just in the practical way you talk to horses when you are working with them. I started telling them things about my mother, about what I was planning to do with my life, about what I was afraid of." "What were you afraid of?" she asked. "Being the kind of person who is never known," he said. "Being very competent and perfectly fine and moving through life without anyone ever really understanding what was happening inside." She was quiet for a moment, tying her stake with careful attention. Then she said, "That is exactly what I am afraid of." He looked at her. "Except the opposite direction," she continued. "Not that no one will know me. That I will let someone in and they will know me and then they will leave anyway, and that will be worse than never having been known at all." Thomas set down the stake he was holding. He turned to look at her fully, the way he rarely did because he had learned she found it easier to be honest when she was looking at something else. "Abigail," he said. She looked up. "I know you," he said. "I have been paying attention for 6 months, and I know you better than I have known most people in my life. And I am not going anywhere." She looked at him with an expression that was doing several things at once, the old fear, and the new and terrifying thing underneath the fear, and the immense effort of allowing the new thing to exist without immediately suppressing it. "I do not entirely know what to do with you," she said, which was the most nakedly vulnerable thing she had ever said to him. "You do not have to do anything with me," he said. "I am just here." She looked at him for a long moment in the April sunlight, with the tomatoes staked around them and the orange cat watching from the fence post and the smell of turned earth and growing things in the air. And then she said, very quietly, "I think I might be in love with you, Malone. That is extremely inconvenient." He felt the words hit him somewhere central and irreversible. "I know I am in love with you," he said. "I have known it since January, but I did not want to say it before you were ready to hear it." "I am still not entirely sure I am ready to hear it," she said. "That is all right," he said. "I will say it again in May." She made the sound that was somewhere between a scoff and a laugh, and this time she let it become the actual laugh, the real one that showed on her face and changed it. And he thought that he could spend the rest of his life being the person who occasionally produced that particular laugh and feel that he had done something meaningful with his time on Earth. He kissed her for the first time that afternoon in the garden, with the steaks only half done, and the cat watching from the fence post with its unsettling calm. It was a careful kiss, the first one always calibrating itself against what it finds, and what he found was that she kissed him back with a fierceness that surprised them both, as though she had been keeping something contained for a long time and had finally decided that containing it was costing more than releasing it. When they separated, she looked at him with a steadiness that was different from her usual studied composure. This was not the careful steadiness of someone managing their reactions. This was something clear and real and slightly frightening in its clarity. "All right," she said, as though something had been decided. "All right," he agreed. The spring and summer of 1879 were the most alive months that Harrow Creek had seen in years, or so it seemed to Thomas, though he acknowledged privately that this impression was partly a function of being himself very much alive in a way he had not been before. He was still at the Harlan spread, still working the long days with Cal and Edgar and Birch, still doing the work well and finding satisfaction in it. But now the work had a context. There was somewhere specific to be going on Saturday afternoons and Sunday mornings, and the specificity of the destination changed the texture of everything that preceded it. Abigail was different with him now, or rather, she was more fully herself. The guardedness had not disappeared, because it was too much a part of how she had been built to simply vanish, but it had relaxed enough to let through more of what was underneath. She laughed more. She argued with him, which he loved, because her arguments were precise and backed by evidence, and she always had a point even when he disagreed with it. She asked him things she had been curious about but had not allowed herself to ask before, and she listened to his answers with the same careful attention she brought to everything. She also told him, slowly and in pieces distributed across several conversations, the full story of her life before Harrow Creek. The minister father whose strictness had been a form of love that had not felt like love, the mother who had been quietly protective in ways that were never acknowledged openly, the brothers who had scattered, the man in Abilene who had looked at her and seen something that cost too much to maintain, Gerald Dugan who had offered kindness but not warmth, and how she had accepted it because she had already stopped believing she deserved warmth. Thomas listened to all of it without flinching and without reframing it into something more comfortable. He simply received it, which was what she needed, and said at the end of the longest of these conversations, "You deserve warmth. I want to be clear about that." She looked at him with something that was very close to undone. "Malone," she said. "Thomas," he said, because she had never yet called him by his first name, and he wanted to know what it sounded like. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thomas," and his name in her voice was something entirely new, something he had not known he was waiting for until he heard it. "Yes," he said, "exactly like that." In July, John Harlan came to Thomas with a proposition. He was thinking of expanding the horse operation. There was a growing market for good working horses in the region, and Harlan had the land and the capital, but not quite the expertise to move from a primarily cattle operation into mixed business without losing ground. He offered Thomas a partnership arrangement. Not a full partnership, but a stake in the horse side of the operation, a portion of the profits, and the use of a small parcel on the eastern edge of the Harlan land where Thomas could build something if he chose to. Thomas went to Abigail with this information on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on her porch in the July heat with their coffee going warm because it was too hot for coffee, but they drank it anyway because it was their thing. "Harlan wants to make me a partial partner," he said. "Horse operation." Abigail considered this. "Is it a fair arrangement?" "I think so. I want a lawyer to look at any papers before I sign, but the terms as he described them seem fair." "There is a lawyer in Crockett," she said. "Mr. Weston, he is competent." Thomas nodded. Then he said, "He is offering me land, a parcel on the east side of the spread, small but good land, enough to build on." Abigail looked at him. She understood exactly what he was saying without him needing to say it in full. "Abigail," he said, setting down his coffee, "I would like to build a house on that land, and I would like you to tell me what you want in a house, because I intend for it to be yours as much as mine." She was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably less than a minute. A hawk turned overhead in the hot blue sky, riding the thermals without any visible effort, and the orange cat lay flattened in the shade near the porch steps. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am," he said. "In a very practical framing," she noted. "I can be less practical if you prefer." "No," she said quickly. "No, I prefer this. I prefer practical. I need practical." She looked at him with the clear, steady gaze that had disarmed him the first time he saw it. "I am not easy to live with, Thomas. I want you to know that plainly before you commit to knowing it from experience." "I know," he said. "I like you anyway. I will argue with you. I look forward to it." "I am not going to stop working," she said. "The laundry business is mine and I am not giving it up." "I would not ask you to," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Yes." "Yes," he repeated, feeling the word settle into him like something finally fitting into its correct place. "Yes," she said again, and this time she reached across the space between them and took his hand, which was not a thing she had ever done uninitiated, and held it with the quiet certainty of a woman who has made a decision that she intends to honor completely. They were married in October of 1879. 2 weeks before the first anniversary of his arrival in Harrow Creek. The ceremony was performed by the Methodist minister, who rotated through town on the church's schedule, and was attended by Clarice Alderman and Hester Clark and John Harlan and his wife Dorothy, and by Cal and Edgar and Birch from the ranch, and by a handful of the town's residents who had been watching the whole thing develop over the course of a year, with the invested interest that small towns bring to such matters. Abigail wore a dress that she had made herself from good blue wool she had ordered from a mercantile in Crockett, and she wore her dark hair down for the occasion, which was not her usual manner, and the combination of these things made Thomas look at her at the altar with an expression that Clarice later described to Dorothy Harlan as the most straightforwardly besotted look she had ever seen on a man who was not a fool. The vows, they said, were the standard words of the ceremony, but when the minister reached the end and asked if anyone had any additional words, Thomas turned to Abigail and said, quietly and clearly enough to be heard, "I am staying." I want everyone here to be a witness to that. Abigail's jaw tightened in the way it did when she was managing something strong and did not want to manage it in public, and she said, equally quietly, "I know. I finally believe you." There was a small celebration at the Red Spoke afterward, with food that Hester provided and whiskey that Clarice provided and dancing that Birch attempted to organize with more enthusiasm than rhythm. Thomas danced with Abigail in the way of two people who are both somewhat uncertain of the steps but are very certain of each other, and she leaned close to him at one point during the evening and said in his ear, "I want a parlor with good light. For books." "Then the house will have a parlor with good light," he said, "and a garden that does not share a fence with anyone else's property." "Agreed. And I want the kitchen on the south side where the morning sun comes in." "Then that is where it will be," he said. She pulled back and looked at him with the expression she still sometimes got, the one that contained the old disbelief alongside the growing and undeniable reality of the present. "Thomas," she said. "Abigail," he said. "Thank you," she said, which from her was enormous because she did not use the words lightly. They moved into temporary quarters at the Harlan spread while the house was being built, in a section of the ranch that Harlan designated for Thomas's use, and spent the winter making plans. Thomas drew the house plans himself with input from a builder in Crockett named Freeman who came out to consult, and pronounced the design sound with only minor modifications needed. The parlor was to have 2 south-facing windows. The kitchen would face the morning sun. There would be a bedroom with good ventilation, because Abigail said she slept better with air moving, and a second room for purposes they did not yet specify but both understood. They also spent that winter simply living together for the first time, which was its own education. Abigail had not been wrong that she was not easy to live with. She was extremely particular about order, had strong opinions about how things should be done that were sometimes difficult to argue with because she was usually right, and had a morning temperament that Thomas generously described as focused and less generously described as formidable before her first cup of coffee. Thomas, for his part, was not without his own particularities. He was quiet in a way that could read as distant when he was actually just thinking. He forgot to mention things that he had been thinking about for days because he assumed they were obvious when they were not, and he had a habit of rearranging things in a space that he found cluttered without asking if the arrangement served a purpose, which had caused 2 significant arguments before he learned to ask first. But they argued and they resolved it, and they figured each other out with the patient determination of 2 people who had decided that the project of understanding each other was worth the occasional difficulty of the work. And in the quiet moments, and there were many of them, in the evenings when the winter dark came down early and they sat by the stove in their temporary quarters, there was a warmth between them that Abigail had told him plainly she had not known she was missing until she found it, which she said in a very practical voice that did not prevent Thomas from feeling that she had handed him something irreplaceable. One evening in December, while she was reading and he was working through some of the horse operation figures that Harlan had given him to review, she looked up from her book and said, "Thomas." "Yes," he said, not looking up from the ledger. "I am happy," she said. She said it with the slight bewilderment of someone making an announcement that they are still somewhat surprised by. He looked up then. She was looking at him with the clear, steady gaze that still, after more than a year of knowing her, could reach into the center of him and rearrange things. "Good," he said, and meant it with everything he had. The house was finished in March of 1880, as the scrub land turned green again, and the horses on the Harlan operation were in the first good weeks of spring temperament. It sat on the eastern parcel as Harlan had promised, a sturdy, well-built structure with the parlor windows facing south, and the kitchen where Abigail had specified, and a porch wide enough for 2 chairs, and a small table that Thomas built himself from the leftover lumber, because he wanted there to be a place where they could drink coffee in the mornings, and watch the light come across the land. Abigail walked through every room of the finished house with the careful attention she brought to everything, touching the windowsills and the door frames and the shelf that Freeman had built into the kitchen wall at her specification. When she got to the parlor and saw the light coming in through the south windows, warm and clear, and exactly what she had described wanting, she stood in it for a long moment without speaking. Thomas stood in the doorway and watched her. She had her back to him, and he could see the set of her shoulders and the way she was holding herself very still, and he knew what it meant, which was that she was feeling something large and needed a moment before she turned around. "It is everything I said," she told the window. "Yes," he said. "You listened to every single thing I said." "Yes," he said again. She turned around and her eyes were bright in the way they got when she was refusing to cry and winning only partially. She looked at him with an expression that had gone past the complicated thing it had been for so long, and had arrived at something simpler and more absolute. "I love you," she said, with the directness she brought to everything, No decoration and no softening, just the clean fact of it. "I know," he said. "I love you. I have loved you since January of last year when you sat in a cold kitchen and told me that your father thought dependency was weakness, and I could see from your face that you had already figured out he was wrong, but it had cost you something to get there." She pressed her lips together. Then she walked across the room and kissed him in the new parlor, in the good light, and he held her the way he had learned she liked to be held, firmly enough that it was real, gently enough that she could breathe. They moved their things from the Harlan temporary quarters into the new house over the course of a weekend, and Abigail's things came from her Harrow Creek house on a wagon that Cal and Edgar helped load. Thomas watched her bring her 8 books and arrange them on the new shelf in the parlor, watched her hang the dried herbs in the new kitchen, watched her set the imperfectly stitched quilt over the chair she placed by the south window where the light was best. "The cats need a few days to adjust," she said, of the gray and the orange, who were investigating every corner of the new house with the focused wariness of creatures confronted with a familiar smell in an unfamiliar context. "They will be fine," Thomas said. "The orange one gets anxious," she said. "I will be kind to him," Thomas said very seriously. She looked at him with the edge of the real laugh. "I appreciate that." They had been in the new house for 6 weeks when Abigail told him on a Tuesday morning in May that she thought she was pregnant. She said it in a practical voice, over coffee at the kitchen table, with the morning sun doing exactly what she had wanted it to do, and Thomas sat across from her and felt something happen to his face that he could not entirely control. "A doctor would need to confirm it," she added, in the way of a woman who does not like to get ahead of confirmed facts. "Yes," he said, "we should go to Harrow Creek." "I know," she said, and then studying him, "Are you all right?" "I am very much more than all right," he managed. She looked at his face with the attention she brought to him when she was reading him carefully, and what she found there made her own expression do something that was wholly unguarded, a warmth and a relief and a tenderness that she still sometimes surprised herself with. "Me too," she said quietly. "Me too." Dr. Vance in Harrow Creek confirmed it in June, with the straightforward practicality of a man who had delivered a good portion of the county's children and treated the news as the unremarkable miracle it was. He gave Abigail instructions about diet and rest that she listened to with serious attention, and then prioritized as best she could alongside continuing to run her laundry business, which she had rebuilt from the Harrow Creek house and maintained through a combination of clients who brought work to her, and a boy named Henry Sutton, who was 14 and strong and willing to do hauling for reasonable pay. Thomas worried about her doing too much, and she told him, with the patience of a woman who had been managing herself for 6 years and intended to continue, that she was perfectly capable of understanding her own limits. He believed her and still worried, which she eventually acknowledged was a form of love, and therefore tolerated with more grace than she might otherwise have managed. The summer was full in the way that summers become when there is new life expected, not just in the pregnancy, but in the horse operation, which had its first genuinely successful season under Thomas's management. He had a gift for understanding what a horse needed in terms of training and temperament, and the animals he worked with came out well-tempered and responsive, which built a reputation that brought buyers from as far as the Panhandle, and once from a ranch operation in New Mexico territory. John Harlan was satisfied, which was his highest form of expressed pleasure, and he told Thomas in September that the partnership arrangement was working out better than he had hoped, and that the land Thomas was using was formally his as part of an adjusted agreement that Weston and Crockett drew up in legal language. Thomas came home that September afternoon and told Abigail, and she listened with the focused attention she gave financial and legal matters, asked 3 precise questions about the terms, and then said, "That is very good." "We own this land," Thomas said, still hearing it himself. "We own this land," she agreed. And there was something in her voice that understood exactly what that meant, not just practically, but as a fact about where they were compared to where they had each come from. She was 7 months along by September and moving differently, with the careful adjustment of a woman managing a changed center of gravity, with the determination not to be managed by it. Thomas had taken over the heavier work at the house without making a production of it, and she had accepted this without protest, which he understood as a significant form of trust. On the last Sunday of September, he found her in the parlor in the afternoon, sitting in the chair by the south window with the imperfectly stitched quilt across her lap, not reading, just sitting and looking at the light. He stood in the doorway for a moment without her knowing he was there, watching her in the way he sometimes allowed himself to, unguarded, wholly absorbed in the fact of her. She turned and saw him, and her expression in that moment of unaware transition, before she composed it back to its usual clarity, was so entirely open that it stopped his breath. "Watching me again," she said. "Always," he said without apology. She gestured to the footstool near her chair, and he came and sat near her, close enough that she could put her hand on his arm if she wanted to, which after a moment she did. "I keep thinking about her," Abigail said, meaning the baby, though they did not know yet whether it was a her. "What do you think about?" "What to tell her," Abigail said. "Or him, what kind of things to say." She paused. "My father told us to be self-sufficient. I do not think I will tell mine that." "What will you tell them instead?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the afternoon light. "That the world is hard and it is worth it," she said. "That working for something real is different from working to prove you do not need anyone. That a person can be strong and still let someone in." She glanced at him with the edge of a smile. "I had to be taught the last part." "You taught it to yourself," he said. "I was just nearby." "You were considerably more than nearby," she said, but fondly, in the way she was sometimes fond with him, which was not soft exactly but was warm in a way that was entirely hers. Their son was born on the 14th of November, 1880, in the new house with the south-facing parlor windows and the kitchen where the morning light came in. The birth was attended by Dr. Vance and by Dorothy Harlan, who had quietly made herself available without being asked, because she was the kind of woman who understood when presence was more useful than announcement. The labor was long and difficult in the way that first labors often are, and Thomas spent most of it in the main room waiting with a patience that was not passive but active, doing and redoing small tasks to keep his hands occupied and his mind from constructing worst-case possibilities. When Dr. Vance finally came through the door and said they were both well, Thomas sat down in the chair closest to him, because his legs had apparently decided that was sufficient information to stop working temporarily. When he was permitted into the bedroom, Abigail was exhausted in a way he had never seen her, completely wrung out, her dark hair damp against her face, her eyes heavy, and she was holding their son against her chest with an expression that was entirely new. He had seen her face do many things over the course of the last 14 months. He had not seen this. It was a kind of ferocity and tenderness combined that seemed to open something in her that had always existed but had not previously found its right expression. "Thomas," she said, when he sat beside her on the edge of the bed. "I am here," he said. "He is very red," she said, looking at the baby with the same honest assessment she brought to everything. "He is perfect," Thomas said. She looked at him over the baby's head and her eyes were bright again, and this time she did not bother winning. She let the tears come, which was such a departure from her usual fierce management of herself that it moved him profoundly, and he reached out and took her hand and held it while she looked at their son and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. "What do we name him?" she asked. "What do you want to name him?" She thought about it. "James," she said. "My father's name was James." He was not a warm man, but he was honest and he was principled, and I think those things are worth honoring even when the person was imperfect. "James," Thomas said. "It suited." "James what?" "James Gerald Malone," she said. "Gerald was not a perfect husband, but he was decent and he gave me this land and this life, and I think that is worth something." Thomas looked at her, the woman who carried everything and held grudges against nothing, who was harder on herself than on anyone else who had ever wronged her, who had spent years being certain she was not worth staying for and was still learning, even now, to believe otherwise. "James Gerald Malone," he said. "That is a very good name." James was a loud, certain, opinionated baby who slept in short, aggressive bursts, and then woke with the conviction that the world owed him immediate attention, which Thomas privately thought was inherited from his mother, and wisely kept this observation to himself. Abigail took to motherhood with the same fierce practical attention she brought to everything else. She had opinions about how it should be done, and she did it those ways, and she learned the rest as she went with the speed of someone who has never allowed herself to fail at things she has committed to. Thomas found himself watching both of them, his wife and his son, with the specific overwhelmed gratitude of a man who had spent a long time not being sure what stopping would feel like, and had now discovered that it felt like this. Like Sunday mornings with coffee at the porch table, while Abigail managed a nursing baby with one hand and her morning cup with the other. Like James's first real smile, which appeared in January when he was 2 months old, and appeared to be directed at the orange cat, which Thomas found both accurate and appropriate. Like the way Abigail looked at him, sometimes, when she thought he was not looking, with an expression that contained so much, the old wariness, and the long work of trusting, and the current reality of love that had accumulated through a year and a half of small, consistent moments, into something so solid it had become the structure they lived inside. Harrow Creek grew in 1881 and 1882. As the region grew, the cattle economy brought people and money, and new businesses arrived, and the town that had existed in the in-between began to feel less in-between and more established. Fitch, the man who had tried to bully Abigail over the laundry price, left town in 1881 after a business dispute that Thomas heard about secondhand and did not investigate, because Abigail said it was not their business and she was right. The laundry operation continued to grow. Abigail hired a second helper in 1881, a woman named Rosa who was a recent widow with 2 young children and needed reliable work, and treated her with the fairness of someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be a woman relying on her own industry. Rosa was grateful and capable, and the 2 women developed a working relationship that over time became something warmer, not the easy intimacy of women who had been friends for years, but the genuine mutual respect of women who recognized each other clearly. The horse operation also grew. Thomas expanded carefully, the way he did everything, not overreaching, not moving faster than the foundation could support, but steadily building on what was working. He had a particular reputation now for horses that were well-tempered and reliably trained, and buyers came to him specifically, which was a different and better thing than having to find buyers. Harlan, in one of their quarterly conversations about the partnership, said that Thomas had built something real and that he was glad he had made the offer. Thomas came home from that conversation and found Abigail at the kitchen table with James on her lap and a letter in her hand. "From my brother," she said, with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Robert, the one in Kansas." Thomas sat down across from her. "Good news or bad?" "He wants to visit," she said. And then, more quietly, "He says he heard I was well and wanted to know if we might welcome him." Thomas looked at her. "What do you want?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at James, who was playing with a wooden spoon with the concentration of an engineer solving a significant problem. "I think I would like to see him," she said. "I think I have been telling myself that family is not worth the trouble for a long time because I was hurt by them and it was easier to call them not worth it than to be hurt again." "And now," Thomas said. "And now I have this," she said simply, looking at James. "And I think maybe worth and not worth are more complicated than I made them." Robert Dugan arrived in Harrow Creek in May of 1882, having come from Kansas by rail to the end of the line, and then by stage to the closest point, and then by hired wagon to the door. He was 45, stockier than Abigail, with the same direct eyes and the same contained manner, and he looked at Thomas with the assessment of an older brother, which was understandable, and at Abigail with an expression that contained the complicated unspoken history of siblings who have been shaped by the same difficult upbringing and have never quite talked about it. They talked about it, eventually, not immediately, but over the course of the week that Robert stayed. It happened gradually, the way these things do, with conversations that started practical and moved deeper as the days gave them permission. Thomas made himself usefully absent during the most important of these conversations, working long hours at the ranch, and coming home to find the two of them at the kitchen table with the lamp lit, and the expression of people who have been talking hard truths. On the last evening of Robert's visit, Thomas came in late to find Abigail alone in the parlor, in the chair by the window, and the look on her face was exhausted in a different way from physical exhaustion, the way a person looks when they have been doing important emotional work and have arrived somewhere they did not entirely expect. "All right?" Thomas asked. "I think so," she said. "We said things we have not said, things that should have been said a long time ago." She paused. "He told me that the family talked about me after Gerald died, that they worried, and that none of them knew how to reach toward me because I had always seemed like someone who did not want reaching." Thomas sat down near her. "How did that feel to hear?" "Terrible," she said honestly. "And also right, I had been that person. I had made myself someone who did not want reaching because wanting it and not getting it had cost too much." She looked at him. "You figured out how to reach me anyway." "You let me in," he said. "Eventually." "Eventually," she agreed with the dry quality that was the understatement of a woman who had made him wait a very long time. "Robert wants to write regular letters. He wants to know his nephew." "Good," Thomas said. "I said yes," she said. "I said we would write back." She reached across to him in the lamplight, the same gesture she had made on the porch when she said yes to his proposal, taking his hand with the quiet certainty of a woman who has made decisions she intends to honor, and he held it the way he had learned to hold it, firm and real and with no intention of letting go. "Thomas," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want you to know that I know," she said. "I know what you did, coming to this town and staying, setting that bag down, all of it." She paused. "I know what it cost you in terms of not knowing if it would work, and I know what it would have meant if I had kept refusing, and I want you to know that I know. You were worth any amount of staying for," he said without hesitation. She looked at him for a long moment with the clear, direct gaze that had disarmed him from the first moment in the road outside her fence, and then she said, "I am starting to believe that." "Good," he said. "I will remind you whenever you forget." "I may need reminding," she said. "I know," he said. "I will be here." Robert went back to Kansas with a letter for his brother in Missouri, and a photograph taken by a traveling daguerreotype photographer who happened to be in Harrow Creek that week, of Thomas and Abigail and James standing in front of the house with the garden visible behind them and the orange cat visible in the lower left corner of the frame, which had not been planned but seemed appropriate. The summer of 1882 moved through its long hot days with the particular pace of people who are not waiting for life to begin, because it is already in full progress. James was a year and a half old and had begun the specific and demanding project of walking, which he pursued with a determination that was entirely characteristic, and that kept both his parents in a state of divided attention, because he had not yet developed any instinct for which directions were safe and which were not. He was also beginning to talk, in the halting, experimental way of children learning that sounds correspond to things, and the first word he said that was clearly intentional was what Abigail reported to Thomas with a mixture of pride and amusement. It was horse, which he said while pointing at the paint, who was standing in the near pasture and seemed entirely unmoved by the honor. Thomas's second most important horse's conversation of the year was with a buyer from New Mexico Territory named Cardenas, who came to look at several animals and stayed for 3 days working out the terms, and who was so impressed with the operation that he mentioned it to 2 other operations on his way back through, both of which sent letters to Thomas by August. Abigail read the letters with the same careful attention she gave all business matters and said, "You are going to need another person." "I know," Thomas said. "I have been thinking about Birch." Birch, from the Harlan operation, had finished his second season and was looking for something more settled. He was 21 now and had grown into the work in the way of young men who are genuinely suited to it. And Thomas trusted him with horses in the way you trust someone when you have watched them work for 3 years and seen how they behave when things go wrong. He offered Birch a position in October. Birch accepted with the enthusiasm of a young man who had been hoping to be asked and had been trying not to show it, and Abigail told Thomas that she liked Birch and considered him a good choice, which was high praise from a woman who used the word good only when she meant it exactly. By autumn of 1882, the world they had built together had its own clear shape. The house on the eastern parcel was a home in the full sense, worn in places, deeply lived in, containing the evidence of two people's particular selves in the arrangement of the books and the placement of the chairs, and the way the kitchen smelled of the herbs that Abigail continued to grow and dry. James's increasing presence had added a layer of cheerful chaos that neither of them had anticipated loving quite as much as they did: the toys in corners, the small fingerprints on the window glass, the way he walked into a room and immediately changed what was happening in it. They had also developed the specific ease of two people who have learned each other well enough to move through the same spaces without friction, who know which silences are comfortable and which mean something, who have argued enough times to know the difference between a disagreement that needs resolution and a matter of preference that simply needs acknowledgement. Thomas had stopped rearranging things without asking. Abigail had started making 2 cups of coffee in the morning without being asked. These were small things, and they were everything. One evening in November, 2 years after James was born, Abigail sat down across from Thomas at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "I think I would like another child." Thomas looked up from the horse records he had been reviewing. He looked at her for a moment, reading her expression in the way he had learned to read it. There was no uncertainty in it, which meant she had been thinking about this for some time. "Then we should have another child," he said. "I am not asking permission," she said, with the precision that still sometimes made him smile. "I know," he said. "I am saying I want the same thing." She looked at him with the expression she got when he said exactly the right thing, which was a relief to him every time because he did not always manage it. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was quiet in the way that established lives are quiet, full of small events that did not seem dramatic but accumulated into the texture of a life. Robert's letters came from Kansas on a regular schedule, as promised, and they wrote back. And over the course of the correspondence, the relationship between the siblings slowly rebuilt itself into something that was not what it had been before, but was real in its current form. The brother in Missouri also wrote eventually, after Robert apparently made contact, a short and slightly awkward letter that Abigail read and reread, and then answered with the directness she brought to everything. And Thomas found her at the kitchen table composing it one evening with the fierce concentration she brought to difficult tasks. "How is it going?" he asked. "It is very hard to write to someone you have not talked to in 7 years, she said. "There is too much ground to cover and it all seems both important and impossible to say." "You do not have to cover all of it at once," he said. "I know," she said. "I am trying to remember that." She finished the letter and sent it, and it was returned with a reply that was longer and less awkward. And the correspondence built slowly in the way of things grown carefully from fragile starts. Their daughter was born in August of 1883, a strong-lunged, dark-eyed girl who announced her arrival with considerably more volume than James had managed, and who, when Thomas held her for the first time, looked up at him with the expression of someone assessing a situation and finding it provisionally acceptable. He looked back at her and felt exactly what he had felt when he first held James, the particular vertigo of enormous love, but differently textured, because this time he knew what was coming. He knew what it felt like to watch a child learn the world. He knew the particular joy of it, and he had been waiting for it. "She is not red," Abigail said, with the dry satisfaction of comparative analysis. "She is a much better color." Thomas laughed, holding his daughter, and the sound filled the room, and James came to the doorway and looked at the situation with the thoughtful expression of a child assessing a changed reality. "Baby," James said, pointing. "Yes," Abigail said. "That is your sister. Her name is Eleanor." "Eleanor James," Thomas had said. "Eleanor Rose Malone," Abigail had said, correcting him with the patient firmness she brought to matters where she had already made a decision. Eleanor Rose it was. She had her mother's eyes and her father's temperament, which was to say, she was calm and attentive in the way of someone who processes everything before responding, which made her the easiest baby in most respects and the most alarming in others, because you never knew what she was thinking until she had decided. She and James developed the specific complicated dynamic of siblings who are genuinely different in temperament and deeply attached to each other, which expressed itself in equal measures of cooperation and argument, and the particular unconditional loyalty of children who have each other as the first fact of their world. The years moved forward the way good years do, not quickly, because they were full, but steadily, with the accumulation of things that matter. The horse operation continued to grow, carefully, at the pace that Thomas believed in. Abigail's laundry business expanded and then contracted slightly when she chose to. When Eleanor was 2, she pulled back to a smaller client roster and used the freed time for the garden, which by 1885 was large enough and productive enough that she was selling the surplus at the Harrow Creek market that had begun on Saturday mornings. Clarice at the Red Spoke retired in 1885 and left the saloon to a younger couple, having apparently decided that 49 was the correct age to stop managing other people's drinking. She did not leave Harrow Creek. She bought the small house 2 streets from the old Harlan Road and appeared, as Thomas noted to Abigail, to be running the social life of the town by sheer force of personality without the requirement of an official establishment. Hester Clark continued to run the boarding house and continued to have opinions about everyone in town, delivered with the directness of a woman who had decided that at 62 she had earned the right to say what she thought. John Harlan slowed down around 1884 and handed more of the ranch's daily operation to Thomas, which was not an official title change, but was a practical reality that both men acknowledged with the satisfaction of an arrangement that had worked out as hoped. Dorothy Harlan brought food to Abigail's house periodically for no stated reason other than that she had made extra, which was Dorothy's particular form of affection. On the evening of their 7th anniversary, in October of 1886, Thomas and Abigail sat on the porch in the October dark with their coffee and the clear Texas sky above them, which was full of stars in the way it only gets when you are far enough from any city light to see what the sky actually contains. James was 6, asleep inside, determinedly having refused to go to bed until 9 o'clock, which was 30 minutes later than permitted but which Thomas had allowed because it was their anniversary and the rules could bend slightly. Eleanor was 3, already asleep when the stars came out because she went to bed efficiently and thoroughly in a way that Thomas suspected was a conscious decision. Abigail was looking at the sky. "My mother-in-law had a theory about the sky," Thomas said. "I remember," Abigail said, "that it tells you things if you read it." "Can you read it?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking up at the dense field of stars over the scrub land and the open range and the good house they had built together and the life they had made. "Yes," she said, "I think I can." "What does it say?" "That this is exactly where I am supposed to be," she said. "That the road to here was longer than it needed to be, but it was the road that led here, so I cannot regret it." She looked at him, and that you are the best decision I ever made, even though you made the decision mostly on my behalf before I was ready to make it myself." He reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand in the dark. "You made it," he said. "The day you made the coffee. The day you said yes. The day you told me you loved me in the parlor with the light coming in. Those were your decisions. You set the conditions for the decisions," she said. "You had to walk through the door yourself," he said. She turned her hand so that their fingers linked, the familiar and specific fit of two people who have held hands through enough years that the hold has its own muscle memory. "Thomas," she said. "Abigail," he said. "I was wrong," she said, "about what I told you the first time, that I was not the kind of woman men stayed for." "I know," he said. "I want to say it plainly," she said, in the way she said everything clearly, without decoration, with the full weight of what she meant. "I was wrong. And you were right to set your bag down, and I am glad you did." He looked at her in the starlight, the woman he had ridden into Harrow Creek not knowing he was looking for, the woman who had told him plainly all the reasons he should leave, and then, when he refused, had slowly, carefully, completely opened the door and let him in. He thought about the saddlebag on the porch steps, the deliberate thud of it, the moment that had said more than words. He thought about Wyoming winters and working cattle and a long series of arrivals in places that did not become anything because he had not yet found the place worth stopping for. He thought about all of this, and then he looked at Abigail and said, "I would set it down again. Every time. 100 times over, in any version of the story." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark, and her expression was the one he had come to think of as her truest face, clear and direct and wholly unguarded, the one that appeared when she had stopped managing how she was seen and simply allowed him to see her. "I know you would," she said. "That is the thing I used to not understand about you and now understand completely." Inside the house, Alina made a brief sound in her sleep that settled back into silence. James's light was still on. He had a habit of reading by lamplight past when the lamp should be extinguished, and they both pretended not to know about it because there were worse things than a child who loved to read. The horses were in the near pasture, the paint among them, older now but still easy-gaited and well-kept. The garden was put to bed for the winter, the beds turned and covered, already being prepared for next spring's work. The parlor with the south-facing windows was full of books, more than 8 now, considerably more, added to over the years in the way that a reader's house naturally accumulates. And the imperfectly stitched quilt was still on the chair by the window where it had always been. The 2 cats were gone. The gray had died in 1882 and the orange in 1883. But there were 2 new cats, a tortoiseshell and a small black one that James had named Captain, both of whom were sleeping somewhere inside in the warm and efficient way of animals who have found their place. Thomas and Abigail sat on the porch in the October dark and held hands and looked at the stars that told them things, and the night was full and still and entirely theirs. She was not, it turned out, the kind of woman men stayed for. She was the kind of woman a man could not have stayed away from, once he had seen her clearly enough. Once he had carried her water and drunk her coffee and watched her laugh and listened to her honest, careful voice saying difficult, true things, and understood that what he was looking at was a person as rare and particular as any landscape he had crossed in 7 years of crossing them. He had set down his saddlebag, and he had never once wanted to pick it up again. Not when it was hard, and there had been hard days when her old fear surfaced, and she turned cold and managed the distance between them with a discipline that still occasionally appeared. And he had to wait with the patience of a man who understood that trust built slowly does not disappear overnight, but also does not run only forward. Not when the work was heavy, and the money was tight in the early years before the horse operation found its stride. Not when James was sick in the winter of 1884 with a fever that lasted 4 days, and had both of them awake through the nights in the lamplight watching his face for the color to come back. Not ever. He had set his bag down in the autumn of 1878, on the porch of a woman who told him plainly that she was not worth staying for, and he had stayed, and everything else had followed from that single quiet act of intention. Every cup of coffee, every argument and resolution, every laughing and every difficult silence, every child and every letter and every evening on the porch under the Texas sky that still told them things if they knew how to read it. In the spring of 1887, a letter arrived from Robert in Kansas, saying that he was planning to come again, this time with his wife Clara, and they hoped to stay for 2 weeks if the invitation was extended. Abigail wrote back within the day to say that the invitation was extended, and the house had room and James and Alina would be glad of cousins to run wild with for a while. She told Thomas about the letter at breakfast, with Alina on her lap and James beside her eating with the specific concentration of a child who has decided that meals are primarily an obstacle between him and whatever he was doing before. "Robert is coming," she said. "With Clara." "Good," Thomas said. "The children should know their family." "Yes," she said, and there was something in the word that contained the whole long arc of what it had cost her to arrive at that yes. The father who had not been warm, the brothers who had scattered, the years of deciding that family was not worth the trouble, and then the slow and patient reconstruction of something real in its place. "Thomas," James said, suddenly, with the directness of a child who has decided something is worth saying. Both adults looked at him. He had lately taken to addressing Thomas by name in moments of great importance, which Thomas found both alarming and deeply endearing. "Yes," Thomas said. "Is Robert my uncle?" "He is your mother's brother," Thomas said. "So yes, he is your uncle." James considered this with the seriousness he brought to factual matters. "Do I have to be nice to him?" "You have to be decent," Abigail said. "Nice can develop over time." James nodded, apparently satisfied with this as a framework, and returned to his breakfast. Thomas looked at Abigail over the children's heads, and she looked back at him with the expression that was her truest face, the one that had taken so long to find its way to the surface and now appeared regularly, in the kitchen in the morning light, and on the porch in the evening dark, and in all the ordinary, extraordinary moments between. She was not, she had said, the kind of woman men stayed for. She was wrong. She had been loved badly and left, and she had built walls out of that experience with the practical efficiency of a woman who knew how to build things, and she had told him the truth of it plainly, and been surprised when the truth did not send him away. And then she had done the hardest thing a person who has been badly loved can do. She had tried again, carefully and slowly, and with both eyes open, and she had found that what was on the other side of the fear was worth everything the fear had cost. Thomas Malone had ridden into Harrow Creek in 1878 thinking about stopping, and he had stopped completely, and the place where he had stopped was here. This house, this land, this woman, this life that had grown from a deliberate thud of a saddlebag on porch steps into something so full and real and deeply inhabited that he could not imagine having ridden past it. He would not have ridden past it. He knew that with the certainty of a man who has thought about his own nature long enough to understand it. He had been looking for something worth stopping for his entire adult life, and when he had found it, he had known it with the clarity of a man who has been paying close enough attention to recognize the real thing when it stands in front of him in a yard, telling him plainly all the reasons he should go. He had not gone. He was glad, every single day that followed, that he had not gone. They had their third child in 1889, another boy, a cheerful, round-faced infant who arrived in May, and was named Henry for the boy who had helped with Abigail's laundry, and who had by then grown to a young man of 22 working at the Harrow Creek General Store. The naming had been James's suggestion, actually, offered solemnly one evening when the subject of the new baby's name was being discussed, and both Thomas and Abigail had looked at him with the surprise of parents finding something admirable and unexpected in their child. "Henry is a good name," Abigail had said. "Why Henry?" "Because Henry Sutton is the best man in town besides father," James said, with the unambiguous conviction of a 7-year-old who has made a quality assessment. Better than birch. Thomas asked. James thought about it. They are equal, he decided, so Henry he was. Henry William Malone, loud and cheerful and delighted with everything, who grew up between an older brother who was serious and careful and an older sister who was thoughtful and quiet, and became the most social of the three. The one who collected people the way some children collect rocks, bringing home friends and acquaintances, and the occasional stray animal with the warm-hearted indiscrimination of someone who finds the world full of things worth engaging with. By the early 1890s, Harrow Creek had grown considerably. The railroad had reached a junction 12 miles to the east that changed the character of the region, bringing commerce and connectivity and new people, and the inevitable mixed consequences of all of these things. Thomas watched the changes with the attention he brought to everything, making careful adjustments to the horse operation as the market shifted, working with Harlan on the cattle side through the pressures that the changing cattle economy brought with it. The town also changed in ways that were more complicated. There were tensions in the region between the large operations and the smaller ones, over water rights that had been simmering for years, over the changing land use as more settlers moved west, and fencing and homesteading changed the open range that the cattle economy had depended on. Thomas stayed out of the political conflicts where he could, and got pulled into them where he could not, and handled both with the level-headed practicality that Harlan trusted and that Abigail, occasionally, had to remind him to apply to himself when he was carrying the weight of other people's problems in a way that kept him up at night. "Come to bed," she would say, finding him at the table with the lamp still burning after the children were long asleep. "I am thinking," he would say. "You can think in bed," she would say, in the tone of a woman who has been married long enough to know that thinking in bed leads to sleeping, which is what was actually needed. He would come to bed and she would be right, and he would be grateful, which was a pattern they both found sustaining. She was right about most things, which was something he had stopped being surprised by and started simply incorporating as a feature of his life. She was also wrong occasionally, as everyone is, and when she was wrong, she acknowledged it with the same directness she brought to being right, which was rarer and more admirable than it sounded. They disagreed about the railroad junction, and whether Thomas should take a contract to supply horses for the operation that was extending a spur line to the north. Abigail thought the scale was too ambitious. Thomas thought the opportunity was worth the stretch, and they argued about it carefully and thoroughly over 3 evenings before arriving at a middle position that was actually better than either of their original stances, which was how their best arguments tended to resolve. He took the contract at a modified scale. It went well. He did not say "I told you so" because he knew better. She did not acknowledge the accuracy of his original position in words, but she made his preferred meal 3 times in the following week, which he counted as equivalent. John Harlan died in the autumn of 1893, quietly in his sleep at 73. Dorothy Harlan was with him, and she told Thomas afterward that he had gone peacefully, which Thomas chose to believe because it was what Dorothy needed him to believe, and because Harlan had lived a full and useful life and deserved a peaceful ending. Thomas stood at the graveside in Harrow Creek's small cemetery and thought about the man who had given him a job, and then a partnership, and then land, and then trust, and felt the particular grief of losing someone who had been part of the structure of his life. Abigail stood beside him at the graveside and held his hand and said nothing, which was exactly what was needed. Dorothy Harlan continued on the ranch with her son, who had come from El Paso to help manage the estate, and the partnership Thomas held remained intact under the new arrangements, because the land was his, and the operation was his, and Harlan had made sure the legal clarity of that was established while he was alive and capable of establishing it. The years continued to accumulate with the richness of a life lived purposefully in a single place. James grew into a young man of 17 with his mother's precision, and his father's patience and an interest in law that he had developed by age 14, and that Abigail said was not surprising, and Thomas said was admirable. By the time James was 20, he was writing letters to a lawyer in Crockett about reading law under his supervision, which was how legal education was largely arranged in the territory, and Abigail said they would support him however the path required, and Thomas agreed completely. Eleanor at 16 was the image of her mother at that age, or so Robert's wife Clara said when the family visited in 1899 and looked at Eleanor with the recognition of resemblance across time. Eleanor had her mother's dark eyes and her direct gaze and her father's calm, but her own particular quality of warmth that was neither quite Abigail's nor quite Thomas's, but entirely her own. She moved through the world with a generosity that made people feel welcomed, and she was studying in every book she could get her hands on, having decided she was going to know everything worth knowing. Henry at 10 was Henry, still cheerful, still collecting people, still the gravitational center of any group of children within range, loved with an exasperated affection by his older siblings, and regarded by both his parents as the member of the family most likely to be running something large by the time he was 30. In the autumn of 1901, Thomas and Abigail sat together on the porch as they always did when the evenings were right for it, and the land around them was the land they had been given and built on and cared for across more than 2 decades, and the sky above them was the Texas sky that Thomas's mother had believed told you things. James was 20 and away, reading law in Crockett and writing letters home every 2 weeks with the regularity that Abigail had established as the minimum acceptable correspondence. Eleanor was 18 and had just told them that she intended to attend the women's college in San Antonio if they would help her make it possible, which they had both agreed to immediately and completely. Henry was 12, and at that moment doing something in the barn that Thomas was going to investigate in a moment, but did not want to interrupt this for. Abigail's hair had silver in it now, threaded through the dark in a way that had appeared gradually over the past few years, and that Thomas had told her he found beautiful, which she had received with the particular expression of a woman who does not quite believe it and is trying to decide whether it is worth arguing about. Her knees still had opinions about rain, as they always had. Her voice was still clear and direct, as it always had been. She still laughed with the surprise of someone who has not entirely accepted that she is the kind of person who gets to laugh often, though that reluctance had considerably diminished over the years. "What is the sky telling you tonight?" Thomas asked. She looked up at the deep autumn sky, dark blue and enormous over the open land, full of the stars that the distance from any city allowed you to actually see. "That we did well," she said, "that it was worth it, all of it, all the hard and the scared parts and the wrong turns because they were the road here." She paused, "and that I would do it again, from the beginning, knowing everything." "Including the part where you told me to leave," he said. "Especially that part," she said. "Because that is the part where you set the bag down." He looked at her in the autumn dark, the woman he had not left, the woman who had been certain she was not worth staying for and had spent 23 years learning that she was wrong, the woman who was his home in the most complete sense of the word, not just the house and the land which were home, but the person inside them, which was home at a deeper level than any building. "I would do it again," he said. "From the moment I rode into town, every single thing." She took his hand in the dark and held it with the familiarity of 23 years and with the warmth that had been there from early on, growing from something careful and fragile into something solid and permanent and entirely sustaining. "Thomas Malone," she said. "Abigail Malone," he said back. She turned to look at him, and her expression in the starlight was the truest one, the one without management or distance, just the full clear fact of who she was and what they were to each other and what had been built between them across all these years. "I am glad you stayed," she said. "I know," he said. "I am glad you let me." She looked at him for one more long moment, and then she turned back to the sky, And they sat together in the quiet evening with their hands linked and the stars overhead, and the horses in the pasture and the house full of their children and their books and their particular accumulated life. And there was nothing unresolved and nothing left unsaid that needed saying, and the night was wide and full and completely theirs. He had set the saddlebag down. He had never once picked it back up. And the life that had grown from that single deliberate act of staying was everything. Every hard morning and warm evening and ordinary extraordinary day, every argument resolved, and every laugh surprised out of her, and every child born into the life they had made together, every moment of being known completely by a person who had first told him she was not worth knowing, and had been so entirely wrong. The Texas sky turned slowly overhead, and they sat on their porch, and they were home.